The sun was shining brightly over the park, casting long shadows beneath the swings and slides. Children's laughter filled the air as they ran across the grass, playing tag, swinging high into the sky and racing each other around the jungle gym. The joyful sounds of carefree childhood echoed throughout the playground, but there was one boy who sat quietly, watching from a distance. Daniel, a shy, kind-hearted 10-year-old black boy, sat on a weathered bench near the edge of the park, gripping a soccer ball in his hands. His sneakers scuffed from play, his shirt slightly wrinkled from the morning's excitement. But his face carried a hopeful expression. He watched the other children with longing, his eyes following their movements, wishing for a chance to join in. But despite the laughter around him, Daniel felt a weight in his chest, a loneliness he couldn't shake. As he sat, his eyes flitted between the groups of kids. Some were playing tag, others were in a game of kickball, and a few were running around the soccer field, kicking a ball between them. He loved soccer. It was his favorite sport, something that made him feel free. He had practiced every day with his father before school, dreaming of playing with the other kids, showing them what he could do. Taking a deep breath, Daniel finally mustered the courage to stand up. He clutched his soccer ball tightly and walked across the playground toward a group of kids who were playing a game of kickball. They were laughing and calling to each other, having fun, and Daniel's heart raced as he approached them. "Hey, can I play?" he asked softly, his voice a little unsure. The group fell silent for a moment, the game halting as they turned to look at him. Daniel shifted nervously on his feet, hoping they would welcome him, just like he'd seen them do with others. Logan, a boy around his age with sandy hair and a slight smirk, raised an eyebrow and looked Daniel up and down. "We don't play with people like you," he said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. The words hit Daniel like a punch to the stomach. His face flushed with embarrassment, his shoulders sagging as the other kids turned away, resuming their game without another glance in his direction. Daniel stood frozen for a second, the sting of rejection overwhelming him. His chest tightened, and the soccer ball in his hands suddenly felt too heavy to hold. Quietly, Daniel stepped back, his heart aching. He turned away from the group, feeling the tears well up in his eyes. He didn't want anyone to see him cry, so he quickly wiped his eyes with the sleeve of his shirt and walked back to the bench. Sitting down, he tried to act like it didn't matter, like he wasn't hurt by the words, but inside he felt crushed. His soccer ball sat beside him on the bench, untouched. The sound of laughter echoed around him, but it felt far away, like a world he couldn't reach. The other kids seemed so full of life, so full of friendship and fun. Why couldn't they see him for who he really was? Why couldn't they just give him a chance? He had so much to offer, but it seemed like his chance was slipping away. Daniel forced himself to sit still, staring ahead at the game he couldn't be part of. His chest tightened with the weight of rejection, and the tears he tried to hold back threatened to spill over. But he kept his gaze forward, hoping no one would see how hurt he truly was. Madison and Logan were the undisputed leaders of the group. They were siblings, both around 11 years old, with matching blonde hair and confident smiles that often bordered on smug. Their family lived in one of the grandest houses in the neighborhood, a place where the lawns were always neatly trimmed and the windows gleamed in the sunlight. They were used to being in charge, used to being the center of attention. And the other kids, like a flock of birds, followed them without question. Madison, with her sharp features and well-maintained clothes, had an air of superiority that radiated in everything she did. Logan, Her older brother mirrored her attitude. He had the same arrogant smile, the same sense of entitlement that made him the natural leader of the boys. Together, they created an invisible wall around themselves, a barrier that no one dared to cross unless they followed the rules they set. When Daniel had approached their group earlier, Madison exchanged a glance with Logan, and without saying a word, they both knew what the response would be. Logan's words, "We don't play with people like you," were deliberate, meant to enforce the status quo. Their rule was simple. Those who didn't belong in their world weren't welcome in their game. The others in the group stood by, some of them uncomfortable, but none of them daring to speak up. Emma, a shy girl with brown hair, shifted her weight from one foot to the other, looking at Daniel for a moment before quickly turning her eyes back to the ground. She wanted to help, wanted to do something, but the fear of being ostracized for defying Logan and Madison was too much. Jack, a boy with glasses and a nervous smile, glanced at Daniel as well, his conscience clearly at war with the exclusion happening before him. But he, too, did nothing. He had always been quiet, always hesitant to break away from the pack, especially when it meant risking being pushed to the margins of the group himself. They all stood in silence, unwilling to stand up for what was right, and in doing so became complicit in the hurtful words that Daniel had just endured. Daniel sat on the edge of the playground bench, watching the other kids run and play, the sounds of their laughter and shouts ringing in the air. Despite the fun around him, his heart felt heavy. He hugged his soccer ball to his chest, trying to ignore the hurt and pretending that he wasn't upset. It was hard, though, hard to watch everyone have fun while he sat alone, just because of who he was. As his gaze wandered, he noticed a small figure near the swings. It was Sophia, the youngest of the group, struggling with her shoelaces. She tugged at them in frustration, her little fingers fumbling over the knot. Daniel couldn't help but feel a twinge of sympathy. She was trying so hard, but was clearly struggling. Without thinking, Daniel stood up and walked over to her. Crouching down beside her, he smiled warmly. "Need some help?" he asked gently. Sophia looked up, startled by the sudden appearance of the boy who had been ignored just moments before. Her eyes widened as Daniel reached down and expertly tied her shoelaces, his fingers moving with ease. His kindness was simple, but it was enough to make her smile back at him. She looked up at him with surprise, grateful for the small act of help. "Thank you," she said quietly, looking down at her newly tied shoes. Before Daniel could reply, Sophia hurriedly ran back to the group of kids, her cheeks flushed, probably hoping that she wouldn't be noticed. But it wasn't long before Madison, noticing the interaction, marched over to Sophia with a look of disapproval on her face. Her voice was sharp as she scolded the young girl in front of everyone. "Don't talk to him, Sophia," Madison snapped, "or you'll end up like him. Do you understand?" Sophia's face faltered. She looked at Madison, then back at Daniel, her eyes full of confusion. But in the end, she turned away, avoiding Daniel's gaze as she rejoined the group. Her hesitation, the silent guilt in her eyes, was clear. She didn't want to be in trouble, but her kindness toward Daniel had already set her apart. Daniel felt the sting of Madison's words, but instead of letting them crush him, he straightened up and glanced at his soccer ball. The world around him might not have wanted him there, but that didn't mean he had to let it stop him. He wouldn't let their rejection dictate who he was or how he felt about himself. He moved away from the bench, walking to the open field in the center of the playground. The other kids continued their games, but he didn't need them. With a deep breath, Daniel set the ball down in front of him and began juggling it with ease, his feet moving skillfully around the ball. He kicked it high into the air, spinning it on his foot, then tapped it gently to keep it in motion. Each trick was smooth, effortless. His heart wasn't heavy anymore. As the ball danced between his feet, Daniel felt a surge of pride. He wasn't going to let them define him. He was good at something, and he would keep showing up no matter what they thought. Slowly, the other kids began to take notice. Some glanced his way, intrigued by his skill. But Daniel didn't look back. He didn't need their approval. He was enough just as he was. The sun hung high in the sky as the group of kids ran and played near the creek that wound through the park. The water sparkled under the sunlight, but its current was stronger than it seemed. The kids had been enjoying a carefree afternoon, their laughter echoing as they hopped rocks and skipped stones. Logan and Madison led the group, but it was Charlie, Logan's younger brother, who had strayed too far. Charlie, no older than 7, had wandered to the edge of the creek, balancing on a rock near the water's edge. He laughed as he skipped another stone, unaware of how slippery the rocks had become from the recent rain. His foot slid, and before anyone could react, Charlie lost his balance and fell, plunging into the creek with a scream. The current was swift, pulling him downstream faster than the other kids could react. Panic spread like wildfire. "Charlie!" Logan yelled, his voice cracking. "Charlie, hold on!" But the current was too strong. The water swirled around Charlie, pushing him further from the shore, his small body bobbing in the rushing stream. "Help! Somebody, help!" Emma screamed, but there was no one around. The other kids stood frozen, paralyzed by fear, unsure what to do. The creek wasn't deep, but the current was enough to pull a child away if they couldn't grab hold of something. From the bench where he had been resting earlier, Daniel heard the commotion. His heart skipped a beat as he turned toward the creek and saw Charlie struggling against the current. Without hesitation, Daniel sprinted toward the water, his sneakers pounding against the ground. His mind raced, but his body moved on instinct. He wasn't going to sit by while someone needed help. The water was cold and strong, but Daniel didn't hesitate. He waded in, the water rising quickly to his waist as he fought against the current. Charlie's cries for help echoed in his ears, and his heart raced. He pushed forward, reaching the struggling boy, who was barely able to keep his head above the water. "Charlie!" Daniel shouted, grabbing the younger boy's hand. Charlie's grip was weak, but Daniel held on tight. With all the strength he could muster, Daniel pulled, dragging Charlie toward the shore, step by step, fighting against the current. He could feel the water pushing back, but he didn't stop. Finally, with a last powerful pull, Daniel yanked Charlie out of the creek and onto the shore, where he collapsed, gasping for air. The other kids stood in stunned silence, wide-eyed, as Daniel patted Charlie's back, encouraging him to cough up the water he had swallowed. Charlie's face was pale, his small chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. Daniel stood back, watching, as Charlie finally coughed up the last of the water and let out a wheeze, looking dazed but okay. The group of kids, still shocked, didn't know what to say. Logan stood a few feet away, his face pale, unsure of how to react. Finally, after a long silence, he stepped forward, his voice low. "Thanks," he muttered, his words laced with a mix of disbelief and reluctant gratitude. Daniel didn't expect more. He smiled softly and nodded, his heart still racing. "I'm just glad he's okay," he replied quietly, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. The group stared at him, still silent, and Daniel couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the world was beginning to see him differently. Daniel sat back down on the bench, his clothes drenched from the creek, his breaths still ragged from the exertion. The soccer ball he had been practicing with earlier now lay forgotten beside him, abandoned in the wake of his rescue. His face was tired, but there was a quiet pride in his posture, the kind that comes with knowing you did something good, something important. The group of kids watched him from a distance, the air between them thick with unspoken thoughts. Sophia, who had been one of the most vocal in rejecting him, now stood apart from the others, her gaze lingering on Daniel. She shifted uneasily, guilt tugging at her conscience. She couldn't shake the image of him diving into the water to save Charlie, risking everything without hesitation. "Why don't we like him?" she asked, quietly, turning to Madison, her voice full of confusion. "He just saved Charlie's life. Shouldn't that count for something?" Madison glanced at her, her face betraying just a hint of hesitation. She had always been the one who made the rules in the group, the one who set the boundaries. But now, with Daniel's heroic act hanging in the air, she felt a flicker of doubt. Still, she quickly brushed off the feeling. "Because he's different, Sophia. It's just the way things are. He doesn't belong with us." Sophia's brow furrowed, and she wanted to argue, but she said nothing. She could sense the conflict in Madison's eyes, but the words had already been spoken. The line had been drawn, and she wasn't sure how to cross it. Meanwhile, back at home, Logan sat in his room, still processing the day's events. His parents were in the kitchen, speaking in low voices, unaware that he was listening. He overheard the conversation between them, their words sharp and dismissive as they talked about those people, black families, and the trouble they brought to the neighborhood. Logan's chest tightened as he heard his parents' casual racism, and something inside him shifted. His mind raced back to the way he'd treated Daniel, the things he had said without truly thinking. He had always believed what Madison and his parents had told him. But now, listening to them, he realized that his prejudice wasn't something he was born with. It was something he'd been taught. It was a choice, one that he had unconsciously made, but now he wasn't so sure he wanted to keep making it. The next day, Daniel returned to the playground, still feeling the after-effects of the previous day's events. His clothes were dry now, but his heart was lighter than it had been in a long time. He picked up his soccer ball and began juggling it with ease, his feet moving in rhythm, the ball rising and falling effortlessly as he balanced it between his knees, feet, and head. From the corner of his eye, he noticed Sophia watching him. She was standing near the swings, her arms crossed over her chest, her eyes fixated on the ball as it danced in the air. Daniel kept his focus on the game, but he couldn't help the small smile that tugged at his lips when he saw her. After a few moments, Sophia approached him cautiously, her footsteps tentative on the pavement. She stopped a few feet away, then hesitated before speaking up, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can you teach me how to do that?" Daniel's face lit up with a genuine smile, his heart warming at her request. He hadn't expected this. "Of course," he replied, tossing the ball gently to the ground and stepping toward her. "It's all about practice. Here, let me show you." Sophia's eyes widened, and for the first time Daniel saw a spark of excitement in her expression. He began with the basics, showing her how to balance the ball on her knee, then how to use her feet to keep it up. Sophia stumbled a bit at first, but Daniel patiently guided her, his encouragement constant. Soon, she managed to juggle it a few times, her face breaking into a shy smile of accomplishment. As they continued, Emma and Jack, Two of the other kids from the group approached, watching in silence for a few moments before stepping forward. "Can we try?" Emma asked, her voice uncertain. Jack, more confident, grinned and added, "Yeah, this looks fun." Daniel nodded eagerly. "Sure. It takes time, but you'll get the hang of it." The four of them, now united by the simple joy of the game, began practicing together. Even though Madison stood off to the side, her arms crossed and her face twisted in disapproval, the others continued to join in. It was as if a silent agreement had passed between them. Madison glared, but no one seemed to care. Daniel's kindness was breaking down the walls, and it felt like the world around them had shifted ever so slightly. Logan, who had been standing with Madison, watched the scene unfold in quiet contemplation. He shifted his weight nervously from one foot to the other, his gaze flickering between the group and Daniel, who was now laughing with Sophia, Emma, and Jack. Something inside him stirred, something he hadn't expected. He realized that he had been wrong, so wrong about Daniel. After a long pause, Logan took a deep breath and walked toward Daniel, his face filled with an awkwardness he couldn't shake. He stood still for a moment, unsure of how to begin. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but sincere. "Hey, I was wrong about you," he said, his words coming out in a rush. "Thanks for helping my brother." Daniel stopped juggling, turning to face Logan. He gave a warm smile, not an ounce of bitterness in his expression. "No problem, Logan," he said gently. "I'm just glad he's okay." Logan shifted on his feet, looking down at the ground for a moment before meeting Daniel's eyes again. "You want to join us?" he asked awkwardly, gesturing to the soccer game that was beginning to take shape between the group of kids. Daniel's smile widened, and he nodded. "I'd like that," he said. As Logan joined the group, the ice finally broke. Madison watched them for a long moment, her arms still crossed, but the tension in her stance had softened. She couldn't deny the change, the transformation that had taken place in the group. Daniel's kindness, his unwavering spirit in the face of rejection, had opened a door that had previously been closed. The game began in earnest, laughter and friendly shouts filling the air as the kids played together, no longer divided by fear or prejudice, but united by a simple game and the kindness of one boy who had never stopped believing that everyone deserved a chance. Daniel's heart raced as he kicked the ball towards the makeshift goal. It was a simple game of soccer now, with everyone joining in, laughing and cheering. The kids, who had once avoided him, were now passing the ball to him, working together as a team. Daniel's kindness and skill had done what rejection and words couldn't. It had brought them together. Even Madison, who had been the most vocal in excluding him, found herself caught up in the energy of the game. She hesitated for a moment on the sidelines, watching the others pass the ball, but as the laughter grew louder and the game continued to flow, she stepped forward. Reluctantly at first, but then, with increasing confidence, she joined the game. "Fine," she muttered. "I'll play too. Let's see if you can keep up." Daniel smiled, not taking her words to heart. He was too focused on the moment, the feeling of belonging, of being a part of something. It wasn't about the game anymore. It was about the connection they had all found, despite their differences. Then, the perfect moment arrived. The ball came to him, and with a swift kick, Daniel sent it flying past the goalie and into the net. For a split second, there was silence. Then, the playground erupted into cheers. "Nice shot, Daniel," Emma shouted. "Way to go," Jack called, giving Daniel a high five. Daniel stood there, his heart soaring. The kids surrounded him, laughing and cheering, their faces filled with joy. And for the first time in a long while, Daniel felt it. He truly belonged. He had always been part of the game, but now he was a part of the group, and nothing felt more rewarding than that. As the afternoon sun began to dip lower in the sky, the sound of approaching cars filled the air. One by one, the kids' parents arrived to pick them up, their cars pulling into the parking lot with soft screeches of tires. The scene on the playground was different now, though, no longer filled with whispers or exclusion, but laughter and the friendly shouts of children. As the parents stepped out of their cars, they stopped in their tracks, surprised to see their kids playing soccer with Daniel. The group was laughing together, passing the ball and celebrating goals. Some parents exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of what to make of the sight, but the joy on their children's faces was undeniable. Logan's mother raised an eyebrow as she watched her son pass the ball to Daniel. "Logan, what's going on here?" she asked, her voice laced with curiosity. Logan glanced up at her, a little hesitant but full of newfound confidence. "It's just a game, Mom," he said. "Daniel's actually really cool. I was wrong to think he was different." His mother paused, taking in his words. "Really?" she asked softly, not sure how to respond, but the sincerity in Logan's voice made her reconsider. Back at home, Daniel sat across from his mother at their small dinner table, the warmth of the meal filling the space between them. He looked up, a bright smile on his face, his eyes gleaming with a quiet pride. "Today, they played with me, Mom," he said, his voice full of hope. "Maybe things are finally changing." His mother's eyes softened, and she reached across the table, squeezing his hand. "I'm so proud of you, Daniel," she said. "You never gave up on kindness, and now they're starting to see it." Daniel smiled, his heart full, knowing that today not only had he changed hearts, but maybe, just maybe, the world was changing too.